This is Boom and Bust in Modern America, Objective 3, about the contemporary, or in other words, modern economy, in this case, since the 1970s. Now, this first slide is something that you should recognize. It's from Objective 2, and it's about people in the 1950s and how they had increased their productivity so much that their standard of living doubled in those 20 years from 1950 to 1970. But this objective is about the 1970s onward, so I want you to think about this particular point as you're looking at this picture. In the 1970s, the entire decade's productivity could not measure up to the productivity that a single year had produced between 1950 and 1970. At 1970s rates, it would take another 500 years to double worker productivity. And that speaks to how big the economic boom was in the 20 years prior to the 1970s. Unfortunately, when we got into the 1970s, the booming economy that had existed for 20 years prior to that all of a sudden went stagnant or not moving. And for that reason, the economy in the 1970s is often referred to as the stagnation period or stagflation, kind of a play on words from inflation or deflation. But the stagnation period was basically when the economy in the 70s almost came to a dead, stagnant stop. The harsh reality was basically this. Many baby boomers who had been born right after World War II, all the way up to 1960, and now we're getting into their adult years, they would not be living as well as their parents had. And because of that, you started to see in the 1970s a recurring theme of depression and apathy setting in. No one really knows what caused the stagflation of the 1970s, but there are a couple of theories. Declining investment, the shift from manufacturing to services, costs associated with government regulations, and in some cases, the Vietnam War is often blamed. In the 60s, spending money on the war while also trying to fund social programs with no real tax increases was pretty difficult to pull off. Money that got spent on the war was taken away from creating jobs here. So goes the theory. But whatever the cause, inflation basically skyrocketed over the course of the decade. People had to make a lot of money on whatever they sold because nobody was buying, which in turn caused even fewer people to buy, according to the law of demand. The higher the price goes, the less likely you're willing to spend on it. What you see here, if you look at the basic characteristics of the stagflation period, stagnant economic growth, basically none, high inflation, and the rising cost of oil, which we'll get into in a little bit. Gross domestic product goes down. Unemployment goes up. Corporate earnings goes down. Prices go up. This is kind of the nature of the stagflation period where nothing is moving. And frankly, we really hadn't done much to avoid this from 1950 to 1970. The economy was booming in one of the greatest, most prosperous time periods we'd ever had, so we rested on our accomplishments quite a bit. In the meantime, the Japanese and the Germans had modernized their production and their products during that time. Over those 20 years, they had improved themselves. We, resting on our laurels, really had not. In the 1970s, they dominated us in a couple of industries. German steel in particular, German and Japanese automobiles as well. In this case, the Volkswagen, as you see here, is from Germany, and the Japanese were also coming out with Toyotas and Datsuns and things like that, things with much better gas mileage than we were producing here. Japanese electronics, like Sony's. These were all industries in which we had been traditionally unchallenged. But Japan and West Germany were now challenging U.S. producers of electronics and automobiles. Again, the automobiles that Japan and West Germany were producing were more along the lines of cars like this, the Japanese Toyota, or the Datsun, or the German Volkswagen. These were all cars during a time in the 1970s of an energy crisis, which we will get into later on, when there were oil shortages. These were cars that were getting upwards of 30 plus miles an hour to the gallon. Meanwhile, American automakers were really refusing to adjust their designs. They just kept producing the same gas-guzzling models that they'd been producing for the previous 20 years. And during the 1970s, when there was a shortage on oil, people really didn't want to buy cars that were getting, 10, 11, 12 miles to the gallon. These models were big classic cars that had been considered advancements from the 1950s. But the reality is that American automobile manufacturers were not facing reality. We were getting to a point where the American consumer was going to want a car that was going to be a little easier on the pocketbook during a time of oil shortages and high gas prices. As a result, throughout the 1970s, you had a pretty eclectic mix of cars in American parking lots. In some cases, you had the Volkswagens, and in some other cases, you had the big American cars and the vans and everything else. It was a pretty interesting mix. By the time you got to 1980, foreign automakers had controlled 25% of the American car market. And it's because they were producing these cars that were, frankly, easier on the pocketbook and easier at the gas pump. Now again, the main reason for the energy crisis that takes place in the 1970s is because of oil. On top of all the problems that we already had, foreign policy problems caused the oil crisis in America. See, in the Middle East, we were backing up Israel. Middle Eastern nations didn't like the fact that we were backing up Israel and decided to cut off our oil. Across the board, oil shortages took place to the point where a lot of gas stations simply didn't have any gas. Those that did manage to have some gas, because it was a shortage, had to charge ridiculously high prices for the gas in America. That, of course, is going to lead to low thermostats and low speedometers and everything associated with that, as Americans finally realized how much they were reliant on foreign oil supplies. Americans had tripled their oil consumption since World War II, and when they realized how much they were dependent on foreign oil, it was a little bit too late. Basically, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, as you can see here, Venezuela, Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, Gabon, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, including Indonesia. These were the major oil producers in America, or in the world at that time, and they were the ones that had cut us off. But the bottom line is that even after lifting the embargo in 1974 and giving us oil again, they still tripled their prices because they realized, and we realized as well, how dependent we were on that. Now, not having oil for cars was bad enough. Not having heating oil for houses, well, that was even worse in 1977, which was the coldest winter in 40 years. If you take a look at these pictures here, this was not very uncommon in the late 1970s, particularly 1977-78. Scenes like this one here might be fairly familiar to people in northern Michigan, but that's because in some of the more recent years, we really hadn't seen storms like that since 1978. When people were facing these kind of conditions and these kind of disasters, frankly, natural disasters of snow, you needed to be able to heat your house. And without being able to heat your house and without really being able to have enough gas for your car because it was too much to pay for, that in and of itself lends to a pretty severe crisis. Now, during this time, inflation is going to go from 6% in 1976 to 13% in 1980, and the U.S. owed $40 billion for foreign oil by 1978, prices that would still continue to be rising by 1980. As a result, old Uncle Sam had figured out that the oil train was about to run him over, and in order to eliminate this oil crisis, we needed to start promoting other sources of energy as well. Solar power started to become, in the late 1970s, extremely popular, as you would get sunlight into the solar panels, that would eventually take it down into the house, convert it from DC to AC, and then allow you to use that energy in your home. The nice thing about solar panels was if there was any extra energy, it would get exported out of the house through power lines and other people could use it. Even today, we still find houses that are very impressive with their solar panel arrays. Again, it was a way to try to find other ways to heat the house without having to use oil to do it. Wind power also became popular in the 1970s, and that's something that is still continued on today as we see orchards of windmills, particularly out west, trying to provide energy and power to various western states, and some out east. Wind power has been successful enough that people continue to build more and more windmills to put in all sorts of places. Hydroelectric power is also something that became popular in the late 1970s, specifically because of the natural energy that it could produce. Now, of course, I don't mean that water directly creates electricity, but the water could turn turbines right down here, and that turbine spinning around could create this generator to spin, and that generator could create electricity. Hoover Dam down in the southwestern United States was producing enough electricity for about 1,000 square mile area around it by the time you got to the 1970s. And of course, the thing that everybody tried to play with in the 1970s, in some cases to dangerous effects like at 3 Mile Island when they had a core meltdown, was nuclear energy. Now, one of the things about nuclear energy is that it is the most efficient source of energy that there is if it is contained, and that's the key word. If it's not contained, you can have a pretty epic disaster here. Now, you have generators up here that would eventually get turned by nuclear energy, but the big thing you want to concentrate on here is the reactor, the core right here. Now, this thing would have a series of nuclear reactions going on in it, and it had to be cooled, and that cooling had to be maintained all the time. If that cooling was not maintained in the generator itself, you could find yourself in a pretty extensive problem with a core meltdown that would release radiation into various areas around, like what happened at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Now, despite the fact that this was a little bit dangerous, it was efficient and it was a good source of energy, and the government recognized that. As a matter of fact, they even gave tax breaks to those who incorporated these various forms of energy just to try to offset the oil crisis that we had experienced during that time. Okay, the next one we're going to be getting into the recovery from the 1970s stagflation period, so thanks for listening.